what you missed was Rahul was talking about scale a lot. There we go. Okay.
There we
Good.
go. Well, oh my God, I've been 45 minutes trying to get on.
It's, yeah. So what
anyway,
can I say?
Pleasure to see you, Esther. Lovely
Likewise.
to see you.
So you've missed an interesting conversation, and we've been talking about this wonderful notion that Rahul had of the sphere of influence versus the sphere of concern, and you can care about all these things, but how much can you actually influence? And that this is the epitome of scale.
Yes.
So yeah. I'd love to ask you, I mean, for the audience, Jeff and I have known each other for years. I was on the board of the Santa Fe Institute, which he epitomizes. And he's been thinking about scale and everything from animals and living beings. And as things scale, they don't stay the same. The complexity increases and all these interactions. And he can talk about that more than I can. But one question I just want to start with is, somebody asked it in the last 40 minutes, as can cities grow indefinitely larger, or what happens is, will the earth become all urban? Will people go back to the villages because the scale of the cities, especially if mass transit is dangerous, changes everything? I mean, in a very small way, you say the larger the city, the faster people walk. Where does that reach sort of diminishing returns? Over to you.
Huge questions, Esther, huge questions. And of course, necessarily some of them require speculation. But as you know, I've spent the last several years, thinking about cities in particular, and trying to put them into a kind of scientific framework, at least bringing that perspective to some of these questions, the very ones you ask. And cities, I mean, one of the remarkable things about cities, like organisms, they actually do scale according, roughly speaking, to mathematical laws, so to speak. There's lots of variations and so on, but as cities grow, we know, sort of very roughly speaking, how quantitatively many of their metrics are going to change. And indeed, one of the deep questions is the one you ask: can cities sort of keep growing forever? Now, one of the things we do know from the same kind of work is that animals can't be, you can't have anything, the whale sort of is about as big as you can ever get. And the whale had to do it by, of course, changing its environment by going to the ocean. I mean, we went to the ocean, so to speak, in order to get buoyancy, to get us away from gravity. Yeah, and so that's cities, so the same kind of theoretical framework leads one to say that sort of in principle, there's no limit to the size of cities. They can sort of keep growing. The world is already over 50% urbanized, and many of the developed countries are over 80% urbanized. And that probably, I would say even very likely, will continue to happen, because cities are this great attractor, this great engine that creates wealth and creates ideas, innovates, but it also creates poverty and inequality and all the other bad things. And that's one of the big issues. But so, you could imagine, you could ask the question, could Los Angeles be, instead of 10 to 12 million people, could it be, 50 million people? And you could go on
and
growing.
Include San Francisco.
And include, yes, and so on. So what happens? Yeah. And of course, you could imagine things continuing in terms of the infrastructure growing, but what does happen, almost certainly, is that the cities kind of balkanize. They break up into semi-autonomous parts, which we already see. You see in very large cities. Semi-autonomous meaning that these kind of socioeconomic network that connects all the people in the city breaks up into pieces that don't really interact very much between them.
So the spheres of influence.
Yes, spheres of socioeconomic influence stay localized in that sense of the infrastructure. The infrastructure may be continuous, but there are sort of these gray boundaries. Some of them are purely geographical, and some are, of course, to do with wealth and culture and so on. But
and race.
And sorry?
And in the US, and race, the heritage of segregation.
Absolutely. And that's always been, I mean, in the past, before race, it was, of course, class. And it still is class, of course, but now race, especially in the United States, has taken on this draconian image, which it's always been there, of course, always been part of the United States. But so there are this kind of quasi-autonomous elements of the city. And you can see why as well, because a city should be defined in terms of those that are connected to the socioeconomic network of the well-being of the city. And of course, if you want to keep expanding, I mean, Los Angeles, for example, is a great example. You already have 12-lane freeways. In order for it to be 3 times its size, you'd have to have 25-lane freeways and railroads that have, 8 tracks instead of 2 or 4 tracks, and so on and so forth. And so if you have the same kind of transportation system, you can't connect people. People cannot remain connected. And the only question that is left hanging in this is that, is it like the whale? The whale we mammals discovered that, boy, we can get rid of this gravity constraint by swimming in the ocean. Have we relieved ourselves of the constraint of the infrastructure by doing what you and I and the rest of us are doing in this, namely going via the internet, where we don't have to be in the same place? And this is a fantastic example of it, where we're all over the world and we're still sort of in a, roughly a connected meeting. It ain't the same, there's no question, because this is, with all due respect to this meeting, but it's like all meetings, it's slightly soulless. It doesn't have the same feeling that we're all in the same room together. We can see the nuances and have a very different visceral feeling. And so it will change. So the question is that going to change anything? The fact that we can do this, it has changed things, but it hasn't changed things that much. I mean, cities are still, roughly speaking, the same as they were when I was a boy, which is a very long time ago, 70 years ago. They're not London, which I grew up in, is not that different, really. It does look different, but the functionality of it is not so different. And the question is that going to accelerate, especially because of this pandemic? The pandemic is a discontinuity, global discontinuity, but also a local discontinuity. And discontinuities, whether they're wars or pandemics or some crash of some kind, accelerate what's already happening. And cities will adapt to that. And
so, I mean, some things have changed. It's like telehealth, for example, or Zoom. Things that people knew they could do, suddenly they now are doing. And so there's meetings, but there's some other interesting things on the horizon. One is simply 3D printing and logistics.
Sure.
Amazon used to have to put all its packages into a single box, and now they've discovered they can actually, because the density is so great, the whole distribution system has changed. And if I can start making things locally instead of having them shipped from some plant in the middle of Michigan, number one, they can come into the city, but they can also cost effectively be built in a village, because suddenly you don't need. How is that going to change? I mean, are we going to discover?
That's another big question, of course. Yes, that's the one. I mean, so that's one of those things that made, I was asked this 10, 15 years ago, these kinds of questions, will people start leaving the city and going to live in small towns and villages and so on. And I wasn't sure at the time, even though my intuitive reaction was, yes, some people will, and mostly they're going to be the rich. But, the rest of us are going to be tied to the city, both because of economic necessity, but also potentially because of social necessity. I think I've sort of concluded, this is probably not quite right, but sort of in our DNA is the need to be together, to really be together physically. I don't mean just to be together like this. This is satisfying a need, but to really be together in the same room, to do things together, to go to the theater together, cinema together. There is a certain need there, and that's what cities satisfy, and they facilitate and that's their job. The job of the city is to bring people together. So I think a counterexample to what was happening, I don't know if it will go on, was the case, of course, of Silicon Valley and San Francisco. After all, Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley. It's in a suburb. In fact, it was a rather rural suburb when it all began, actually, in some ways, Santa Clara Valley. And, all those people live there. And then in the last 10 years, suddenly realized there's this marvelous city called San Francisco, just 35 miles north. What the hell are we doing living in this boring old mountain view and so on? Why aren't we living, or Palo Alto, which is where I used to live, why aren't we living in this boring old place where we could be exciting old San Francisco? And I mean, I'm exaggerating, of course. And there has been, as you well know, this huge flux into San Francisco, which has changed San Francisco, of course. But people have gone there, and it isn't. So the question is, why aren't the bureaucrats and leaders and the CEOs of all those high-tech companies living in little beautiful villages high in the Sierra Mountains, or living here in Santa Fe and so on? Why aren't they doing that? They need this other thing somehow.
Well, they're also doing it, honestly, because they have those country homes. I mean,
yes,
it's like
so
in
they
my
have a second
neighborhood.
home. Yes, that's why I say it's much
It's a
more
rich
the
person's.
well-to-do. It's on. I mean, so that 90% of the people, or more maybe, are simply unable to do that, and the only way they can survive, whether they like it or not, sadly, is to be in the city. Many do enjoy being in the city, but many, of course, suffer because of the whole concept of slum and informal communities and so on are manifestations of that phenomenon in cities.
But for
and
each individual person, how big does the city need to be for them to feel they're in the city? I mean,
oh, that's a good question. I don't know. In the United States, every country usually has a sort of definition, a working definition of a city. It's not, there are the political entities of a city.
Right.
Like San Francisco as a political entity is like 750,000 people, but that's not really what San Francisco is. It's several million. And there's something called the San Francisco Metropolitan Statistical Area. So the federal government here defines it, but all countries have some such definition, the kind of socioeconomic unit that functions. And the smallest ones of those, I think, are considered 50,000. That's sort of a working definition. Now, I live in a town of about a little bit bigger than that, closer to 100,000. And that's just about enough to satisfy my urban needs, so to speak. But this happens to be a special place.
I mean, but this whole notion of scale interacts with things like mass transit systems. And if the scale of operation of a mass transit system is suddenly vastly reduced because you need social distancing, or the utility of the streets, how does that change how a city is defined, how it's going to work? I mean,
well, yeah, I think that's a huge question now, is what is the residue of this? I mean, obviously in the near future, we're going to be doing social distancing, wearing masks, and being careful when we go to restaurants and to go shopping and doing more commerce on the web, and saw more interactions probably on the web, as we said earlier. But I'm also wondering as to whether, if we look even 1 or 2 years down the line, and if COVID-19 is tamed in the sense that we do have a vaccine and it turns into a flu-like phenomenon rather than a pandemic-like phenomenon, then I have a feeling people's memories are quite short. And very quickly, things will return, quote, I'll call it normal, but it'll be obviously different. But much of the things that go on now will actually be resurrected. And people already, we've seen people becoming stupidly cavalier,
Yes.
going out into the streets or on the beaches and so on. And you can sort of understand that. So I'm not convinced that there will be huge change. There will be changes. And one of them, by the way, not only meetings like this, working at home is obviously one of the major ones that was already beginning to happen in a small way. That's going to be much, much bigger.
Right.
And the trusting of people to work at home. Trust becomes even more important now.
Trust and surveillance.
Yes.
But unfortunately, we've reached the edge of our sphere of influence.
Just as we're getting into it.
Exactly. But at least I think our sphere of concern will continue. I'm looking forward to hearing you now interview the next person, and I'm looking forward to hearing everybody else on this
really
interesting. So thank you